name is Al Cacchetti, and I'm the pastoral coordinator here at the Jesuit Spiritual Center, and I would like to welcome you to the second session of our Lenten series, The Ignatian Way, with Father Bill Verbryke. Father Bill said to mention to you that venial sins are $10, mortal sins are $15. Oh, I'm sorry. Without further ado, I give you Father Bill.
My mother told me to don't presume that everybody knows you well or even likes you. So let me start off by really giving you a brief biography of myself. I'm originally from Cincinnati. I went to St. Xavier High School after going to Annunciation Church Parish in Clifton. Graduated from St. Xavier High School in '71 and then went to the fine institution of the University of Cincinnati. I know you thought I was going to say XU for 2 years, and then I joined the Jesuits. And after joining the Jesuits, I came back to Cincinnati in 1989 to St. Xavier High School. I was there until 2001, and then I was assigned to our Jesuit novitiate in Detroit, where I worked with the men who were novices. And we have a set of parents and sister of one of those people, the Spots, were they? They had a son who was one of the novices. And then after that, I was reassigned to Xavier University, where I've been since about a year and a half ago as superior of the Jesuit community. And Milford here has been a place that's been part of my, if you want, spiritual history, certainly from my time as a student at St. Xavier High School, making retreats out here, and then doing some of my own formal training out here, and then being involved out here on the board and helping to give retreats. So that's just sort of a brief sort of history of myself. What I'd like for us to do is to start just with a song, and I put a sheet on your chairs. It's called Something Beautiful. Has anybody heard of the group Tonic Sol Fa? It's a small group like out of Iowa or Minnesota. They are a wonderful, fun group. If you ever have a chance to listen to them in concert, they just sort of mesmerize you. But I thought when I received from Al the topic that I had for this series, it wasn't the topic I would have chosen. But it's also a good topic to present. Today I did get a text from one of the participants here, but I won't mention who she is, and she asked if I was full of sin yet. And I said no, but I'm sure the participants are home practicing. Something beautiful.
She'll find a treasure.
If we can now pray together, teach me to...
In a thrift store.
Jesuit repetition, too, is a good thing. If we could pray together, the teach me to listen. Teach me to listen, O God, to those nearest me, my family, my friends, my co-workers. The topic tonight is recognizing our own sinfulness. And as I understand, what we're trying to do in this series is to present those of you who are here to participate with an understanding in a way of the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius. And with that, it's to give you an understanding of what they are, but also somewhat of an experience of praying with the exercises. So what I'm going to do tonight is to do some presentation, some background, and then we'll have some time for quiet and small group discussions if you want to break into smaller groups to reflect on some questions that have to do with the topic, namely sinfulness, which is really the thrust of this part of the exercises. Last week, Richard Bowman, I know, presented the part really on prayer, and it really was the part that begins the spiritual exercises. We would refer to it as the annotations and the principle and foundation. I'm not going to go into detail explaining those terms because we could be here all night if I did that. That's just to whet your appetite to come back to Milford for some retreats. Okay. Just by way of introducing, I'm asking you, why are you here tonight? Is it because it's Lent and you are looking for something to do to enter into the Lenten journey? Was it because of the Jesuit Ignatian aspect? Either you've already had a fair amount of experience with it, or you just thought it would be something interesting to be introduced to. Or maybe it was coercion, there's going to be no dinner at home, so this is how you would get your dinner. People come to these things for all different reasons. But I think another part of the question is, what do you hope to get out of this evening? You signed up for it. Some of you have signed up for the entire series. Some of you are here tonight. Maybe it's the only night. Maybe the topic interests you. But why is it that you are here this evening, and what are you expecting to get out of it? Now, to use an Ignatian term, a term that St. Ignatius would use is, what is it that you desire? Desire is a word that used frequently in the Jesuit jargon, in the spiritual exercises, in our own documents. Desires were very important for St. Ignatius, for he felt that through our desires was a way in which the Spirit also works. So, what is it that you desire? And last week, I know Richard talked about prayer and conversation and listening. Well, part of that is we listen through our desires. And through the Spirit, our desires are moved forward. So I ask you now, what is it that you desire as you come for this hour and a half this evening? Take a moment. I'll give you a minute. give you a minute to think about what is it that you hope to get out of this evening. Now what I'm going to ask you to do is take that desire, the expectation, and forget all about it. And let's go with the flow of hopefully what I'm going to present and what you will reflect on, and let the Spirit work with that. That's also part of what Ignatius would have us do, to cooperate with the Spirit and not always to be in control. Control is a big word in our society. And so what I would ask you to do now is surrender to what it is that the Spirit might be inviting you to through our conversation, through our presentation this evening. And maybe it will hook up with what you have desired, maybe not. But let's see how it goes. Okay. So I mentioned this is just 1 week out of the 5-week series. And I believe each of this week and the next 3 weeks we're presenting you with the different weeks of the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius. And before even that, there are certain things that really are foundational to things that are Ignatian, things that are Jesuit. Our institutions really are guided on certain principles and aspects that have come to us through St. Ignatius. Can I ask a show of hands, how many of you are acquainted with the spiritual exercises themselves? Okay, a good number of you. Okay. How many of you would say that you have a good sense of Ignatian spirituality? Okay. So a variety of people in this room. For some of you, the presentation might be repetition. That's okay. As I said, Jesuit repetition is a good thing. Okay. You might also get a nuance to some of the presentation. But when we're talking about Ignatian spirituality, first of all, and you will hear people say this strongly, Ignatian spirituality is a lay spirituality. When St. Ignatius gave us the gift of the spiritual exercises, it was a gift for lay people. Ignatius was not always a Jesuit. He was not always a priest. So the spiritual exercises, which really was the faith journey and the transformation of St. Ignatius, was given to St. Ignatius as a layperson. And the first companions that he invited into receiving the exercises were lay people. But because of how they transformed their lives, they, with St. Ignatius, became special companions. But many people at the time of Ignatius went through the spiritual exercises, did not become companions of Jesus. Likewise today, many people make the spiritual exercises both in their entirety for a 30-day period, in a process that we call the 19th annotated retreat, which you make them in everyday life over a course of time. You know, you pray in the morning, you go to work, you go home and do your stuff, you pray in the morning, you go through the period, and then you meet with the director every so often. You make the exercises in everyday life. Many ways to do it. So the exercises really are not just for Jesuits. Now we have our own take on it, and in our own formation, you know, we live through that. The constitutions of the Society of Jesus, certainly come from the spirit of the exercises and also have certain foundational elements. And some of these foundational elements that are significant when we talk about Ignatian spirituality and the spiritual exercises are things you would hear from any Jesuit who does a presentation. They might phrase it quite differently, but basically it's the same. And some of those foundational statements would be, our goal is to be with God, and everything around us is a means to that end. All of creation is God's gift to us. Therefore, it is filled with goodness. God loves each person uniquely, overwhelmingly, and unconditionally. God deals directly and personally with each person. We can meet God, who is truly present everywhere in creation, in our ordinary activities, in our everyday, ordinary relationships. Our spirituality, the Ignatian spirituality, is very incarnational. Jesus is present among us. And our spirituality is also very Christ-centered, therefore. So the person of Jesus is central to the spiritual exercises. Any questions on that? Comments? Observations? Anyone? Yeah.
If you're searching for all of that, when do you get there?
When do you get there? I think we can get there in different stages, and maybe different times in our life, depending what obstacles might come our way. But some of it too might be, how do we deal with those obstacles in our life? I, for one, do believe that we can find Christ in anything, even in bad things. It might take a while to find it. We might need help from someone else to determine what that might be. But I think part of our spirituality too is it's good to have a spiritual director, it's good to have people to talk to, it's important to have other people to journey with us. But I think there are ways that we can grow and to develop. Sometimes we might not be totally aware of what's going on inside of us, moving us forward. But I think maybe the goal, if we have a goal that we have to get there, we probably are going to be frustrated. But if the goal is just we live each day as we are able to, and we do our best, and we try and keep, if you want, our prayer life, that conversation that Richard was referring to last week, alive, then the goal in a way isn't that important, because we'll have the goal, which we would say is eternal life. So there are some people, I would say, who have just objectively what I would seem have a pretty good life, that are pretty miserable. Some people have a very difficult life, and I think because of how they choose to live their life and choose to take advantage of maybe what invitations are there, are very joyful. Does that answer your question? Okay. Any other comments? Okay. The 4 week of the exercises that I referred to, they really are not weeks, but movements. But they come out to about 30 days. Okay. The first week really begins with that sense of being loved by God, pretty much what Richard was talking about last week. We are loved by God. That is the starting point. We are creatures of God. We are created to love. We are created in love, and we are created to really form that relationship with God and all of creation. That relational aspect is very important. And then when we have that sense of really experiencing God's love, and that's what we do in the first part of making the exercises, Then we move to taking a look at how maybe we have not always loved as we should. So we move into sin. And with that, we cannot separate it from God's love, nor can we separate it from God's mercy. That's the dynamic of the first week. After experiencing that sense of creation, how we are part of creation, how we are gifted with creation, and yet life is not perfect. So we move in that sense of exploring our sinfulness, which we will talk about in a little bit. But then when we move into the second week, it's dealing with Christ life. So very much it's really going through the scriptures and coming to live and get to know the person of Jesus Christ. And Ignatius has us do that in very creative ways. It's not just reading the Bible and saying this is who Jesus is. It's allowing us to become, again, in a very strongly personal relationship with Jesus and coming to know Him intimately. And in the process, Jesus gets to know us. And then the third week, we move to Christ, suffering, and death. And it gives us that opportunity to walk with Jesus in that journey of His suffering and death. So during that time, the focus really is on Jesus' own pain and suffering, not on my own, even though that is naturally an aspect that will come up and you would pray through. But it's really about being with Jesus in His own passion and death so that we can join in the resurrection. Jesus is the only one that knows about the resurrection. We can have some sense of pain and suffering and sickness and death, but only Jesus has gone through the resurrection. But yet we're all called in that fourth week to celebrate and to join in that. For that is ultimately what we are called to join in that joy and the peace that is that eternal life with God. So that's sort of a sense of the 4 weeks of the spiritual exercises. And in the next, tonight and the next 3 weeks, you'll get a fuller understanding perhaps of what some of these weeks are about. But in this first week, the week of sin, of coming to recognize our sinfulness, it is based on a confident trust in God's loving care. And the retreatant needs to have a disposition of generosity and magnanimity. And with that, a sense of trust, of allowing to be led by the Spirit. If I were directing, say, a novice, which I did for 8 years, in the spiritual exercises, and they were having a difficult time truly experiencing God's love in their life, and for some reason they just were not able to trust and to be generous, even though they really were trying. Maybe there were obstacles in their life. We probably wouldn't move on into the retreat, because the retreat is really based on movements. So you don't just jump from this week to the end without going through the process. So St. Ignatius, even when he would give the retreats, did not always allow people to complete the retreat, because for whatever reason, the grace or the gift of the movement was not there. Not because the person was a bad person or because God did not love them, but there's just something there that the movement was not there to move forward in the structure, which has a lot of flexibility, but there is a structure to the spiritual exercises. In this first week of the exercises, there are certain desires or graces that we pray for. Again, Ignatius was very big on desires. He was very big on graces. So in the spiritual exercises with the different movements and moments and periods of prayer, there would be a grace prayed for. Again, it's gift. You might not receive it. You might not receive it in the way that you want. But that does not mean that somehow there's not movement going on. But once a person has moved forward with that sense of being loved by God and wanting more and looking into one's sinfulness, there's a grace that you ask for. And again, different ways of framing that grace. To grow in an awareness of sin and injustice in our world, to which God has responded with mercy and love. To experience my own blindness, deafness, and insensitivity to sin and evil. To understand death as a reality, as a consequence of sin and teacher of values. To experience God's mercy and love for me as one caught up in the human story of sin. To receive a personal, intimate understanding of sin and of God's tender mercies. It's more than just listing my sins. It's really coming to understand myself in relationship with this God who loves me unconditionally. And yet, for whatever reasons, I do not always respond in kind. That's my sinfulness. And there are different ways of perhaps viewing our sinfulness. There are different ways that we are sinful. But Ignatius doesn't immediately jump into that sense of looking at my personal sin. One thing that he has us do is to stand before a crucifix, or to hold a crucifix in our hand, and to pray. And it's to pray not to experience that suffering of Jesus. It's not a prayer to experience the passion. That will come later in the retreat. But to hold that crucifix, or to stand before that crucifix, and to pray understanding God's love for us. The love of Christ hanging on the cross is Christ dying for us out of love. It's the response of Jesus to God. It's a response because the Trinity loves us. And Jesus became incarnation. He became Word. And He died for us out of love. It's a personal relationship that God has with us. And we take that crucifix and we ask three questions. What have I done for Christ? What am I doing now for Christ? And what response should I make to Christ? And the purpose of this exercise is not to answer those questions, but just to have that as a frame of reference, that I am loved. And this is the greatest symbol of God's love for us as I move forward in the retreat experience. And Ignatius has us start really with the history of sin. Again, we are not jumping right into our personal sin. Sometimes that might be easier, but it would not give the full understanding of what this movement in the spiritual exercises is all about. So we look at the history of sin with the angels, that cosmic sense of sin, the world of spirits. Then we move into the sin of Adam and Eve, truly naked before God. God trusted them, and yet they did not fully live up to that trust that God had for them. And then the sin of Cain and Abel, the sin of Cain and Abel. What evil does? That sense of sibling rivalry. Have any of us ever experienced sibling rivalry in your families? It can do pretty awful things. And yet we see in Cain and Abel, one son killed, a perpetuation of sinfulness. And then moving into individual sin, not yet personal sin, but individual sin. Examples such as David and Bathsheba. The sin snowballing. You have David seeing what he lusted after and went for it. And then you had Nathan explaining and trying to get David to see his sinful ways. He wanted something he couldn't and shouldn't have, but he did. It started with a gaze, and it snowballed to the death of an innocent man. So again, individual sin. Peter's denial. Peter denied Jesus, but he repents. Judas does not. He kills himself because he could not live with that sin that he committed. How are we then in our own sinfulness? But even before that, especially in current practices of the exercises, there's a sense of taking a closer look at social sin. That sense that, things perhaps are out of my own personal control. I'm not in control of everything, but somehow I do participate in a cycle of sin. One of the exercises I like to give is for a retreatant to read the newspaper. Certainly with novices, they would not have free rein to newspaper reading. In some retreat houses, it's common practice to make newspapers available. That can be good too. But to have an exercise to read the newspaper from that sense of social sin. What is going on in our world? It doesn't take much to read the newspaper these days and become pretty discouraged. Imagine God looking down on the world and looking at the same activities. That sense of social sin. Looking at the scandal going on in the church today. A cycle of sinfulness. It's awful. And yet that can be part of the dynamic of this week. To understand then my own sinfulness as now contributing into the sin of the world. In the gospel passage of the Last Judgment, we see that Jesus suffers in the neglected. But Jesus is also present in the community. So again, to understand our own sinfulness, not in an isolated way, but that we are part of a community. We have our own families. We have our own circle of friends, people we work with, but the world community. So my sinfulness can have an impact, just as someone else's sin can have an impact on me. So now it's time to take a look at my own personal sin. Who likes to do that? Probably not many of us. But if we do it and we do it well, we really can become better people. We can perhaps correct those things in our life that somehow can make us a better person. How many times have you done something wrong and you say, how could I have done that again? I can't confess that any more time because the priest is getting to know me by one thing. But I can tell you most priests, all priests, don't even remember those things, so don't worry, okay? But how often we can get caught into our own lives. And yet what we're looking at when we look at sin is that broken relationship between me and God. That broken relationship between me and God, but that also can be that broken relationship between me and other people. Because again, our spirituality is very incarnational. Jesus is present in creation. Christ is present in so many things. So my personal sin doesn't just impact me. That could be also a thing of pride to think it's just about me. No, because we are relational people. We have an impact and others impact us. So when we take a look at our personal sin, it's to understand the truth of how we are breaking up relationships with God and with one another. Okay? When I direct novices on long retreats, one of the ways I like for them to come to understand their own personal sin is to ask them to come with a way of determining a core sinfulness. I think most of us, if we're honest with ourselves and we take the time to probably analyze our sinfulness, it's one or two key areas. And I think that's a value in this part of the retreat, to really step back and get a sense of what is my core sinfulness. Instead of just listing 1, 2, 3, and there's this sin, and 1 to 10 and this sin, but to say, what are those areas in my life that by naming them, I can have more control and more power over that, instead of it controlling me. And so what I will ask the novices to do, and other retreatants, is to perhaps use as a frame of reference the 7 capital sins. Remember them? Pride, greed, lust, gluttony, anger, envy, sloth. But I also add, I think, deceit and fear. So I think those are pretty prevalent in today's society. So perhaps to reflect on those areas to see if there's 1 or 2 that sort of, that really sort of captures my own brokenness, how I am broken, and how I break relationships. Another frame of reference is the good old-fashioned works of mercy, the corporal and spiritual works of mercy. To see how am I living them out in my life, or how am I not? In those ways in which I'm not, perhaps that will give me a clue on that shadow side of myself, that side that speaks of that core sinfulness. So to spend some time in prayer to reflect on my personal sin. So it's part of a larger sense of sin, but it does narrow down to my own life. And how is it that in this retreat experience that I can become a person of greater freedom, a person of greater trust, a person of closer relationship, responding to the love of Christ that can be shown in so many ways through so many people. But that sin keeps me from experiencing that love. Ignatius also has us pray over an experience of hell. And certainly at the time of Ignatius, the fiery sense was alive and well. And that can be pretty graphic. But I think another way of understanding an experience of hell is a sense of alienation and loneliness and frustration, not to be in relationship. I know I am not called to monastic life. I've been down to Gethsemane for some retreats, and I love it for 5 days. I need to have stimulation. Hell for me would not to have contact with people, knowing I would not have contact with people forever. That would be something I could not live with. That would be hell. Each of us perhaps has a hell that we could define, describe for ourselves. Well, in this part of the retreat, it's important to know what is the consequences of our sinfulness. And the extreme would be that sense of hell. life without God, life without neighbor, at least without some neighbors. Perhaps not all. But that, again, is part of the movement and the dynamic to understand a life that hopefully is directed toward a life with God. Ignatius also has us enter into different types of conversations, or what we would call colloquies. And at this time in the retreat, Ignatius would have us pray the triple colloquy. Not to be confused with the triple dog dare from the movie Christmas Story. But the triple colloquy or conversation, in which we first of all go and we converse. We have a conversation. We communicate with Mary. Mary has a very special place in the spiritual exercises and in the life of St. Ignatius. So Ignatius would have us go to Mary and to pray and converse with her about our desires for this week, to understand our sinfulness, to understand our sinfulness in relationship to the God who loves us, that we can fully understand it and feel it in our heart. So we go and have this conversation, not just a theoretical Mary up there conversation, but a conversation with Mary. And then Mary and I will go over to Jesus, and we'll have that same conversation, that I might come to fully know and to understand and to receive the gift of that grace, those graces that we mentioned before. And then Mary and Jesus and I will go to God with that same prayer. It's a triple colloquy. At different times in the retreat, Ignatius would have us pray to Jesus. I will sometimes have a retreat and pray to St. Ignatius or Father Verbryke, or choose your parent who is up in heaven. Pray to that person. It can be anybody. But again, it's based on that personal relationship that comes about through prayer, that comes about through conversation. And so finally, as we move through our personal sin and hopefully an understanding, in a sense of how awful it really is, we move into God's mercy. We start the week with the sense of God's love. That's the basis of everything. Of how then we did not fully accept that love and live from that love, but we sinned. We're part of a system of sin. But then we move back to God's mercy. This can be a very challenging grace to receive, because many of us perhaps find it difficult to surrender and to trust that I'm worthy of God's love. That perhaps there's something about me that's not just right, that how could God really love me? I think sometimes that's really a reflection, can I love myself? That I'm projecting on God. Because God does love us. We know that from the beginning of the retreat. We receive those hopefully as graces that weren't just for the moment, but something that we can hold on to. It's the image of Rembrandt, and I wish I had a bigger picture, of the Father receiving the Son back. There is nothing that we can do that God would not receive us back and embrace us. There is nothing that we can do that is so awful that we would break that relationship with God. God is there waiting for us to return. Can we truly believe that? Do we accept that? It's something to pray about and to ask for. Another image I have of God's great mercy and love is when I was in theology out in California. I lived on a hill. And one afternoon I was studying in my room and I heard this scream. So I rushed out and I could see this young boy on a bike going down the hill and his dad running after him screaming. He had a right to be frightened because little boy on a bike, out of control, a long hill, a lot of side streets that a car easily could not have seen going through an intersection. Fortunately, the father caught up to the boy right at our community. So I was looking through the window open of the scene. The father immediately grabbed the boy in the middle of the street and hugged him. Didn't yell at him. I had my own scenario of what happened up the hill. Tommy, I told you! But what probably happened, the father turned his back, the boy got on the bike, and it was out of control. But the father just embraced him and held him for about 5 minutes. I don't think the father was even conscious of any other cars or people were around. I don't even know if they're, because I was so concentrated on them. Finally, he grabbed the boy and the bike and moved him to the sidewalk, and they were all walking up the hill. To me, that's the image of God. It's us going down the hill out of control, and God running after us. And when he catches up to us, he grabs us and gives that sense of security that we really are loved. And nothing that we can do can take that away. Now, there might be a conversation about how you don't get on the bike and point it down the hill, but that can be part of the corrective in our life that we can walk away with from sitting down and understanding my core sinfulness. And what are those areas in my life that really do trip me up? Those areas in my life that continually bring about brokenness of relationship with God, with one another, and deep inside myself. What I'm going to ask us to do now is just to have that quiet time or the discussion time, depending on what you would like to do. I have some reflection questions that might be of help or they might not be. You might want to take these with you and use these in the course of this Lenten time. It's a time to come to understand God's love, your sinfulness, and God's mercy. So as we're handing out the sheets, I'm going to put on another piece of music, which is on the back of your form. And I would say, why don't you come back about 25 minutes, about quarter after, and then we can open up any thoughts, reflections, see where you might want to go with it, okay? Welcome back. Just to throw it out to you, if you have any questions or comments or reflections, any thoughts of where you might have met the Lord tonight? Okay.
Go outside, look up in the sky, and feel the air.
Outside, creation. Mm-hmm. Any other comments or questions?
Recognizing that as sinful as we think we are, the Lord will always give us always what the best way.
Right.
He actually wants to.
Right. It's easier said than done. But it's not easy. It's easy for the Lord, but it's hard for us to fully appreciate that. We tend, I think, to complicate things. You know, we put conditions that God would not put conditions on, I think.
I would just like to say that I find that interesting what you said about complicated life. I think life is becoming more complicated with each year, just as the society in general.
Very much so. And I'm not going to ask you your age, but I would say what you grow up with, what kids are growing up with today are two different worlds, and it's only getting worse. And that complicates it. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Will you know it when we get there?
I think we probably do. Yes. But do we listen well enough and silently enough to know that we might be there? That might be the question. Or again, are we anticipating it to be whatever it is that might not be what God is offering us? Again, I think, part of tonight too was, we make desires and prayers, and God really wants us to. Ignatius invites us to that, to be very specific with our intentions. But that's where, like I had you at the beginning, say, okay, sort of push that aside and allow God to invite you where maybe God would like to see you this moment. Same way, perhaps, maybe we have some of it right now, but we're too busy looking somewhere else, or we want it to be somewhere else, and so maybe we miss it. But I think ultimately we are called to be in that full union with our God, so I think we will get there. My thoughts. Any of you have your own thoughts? Yeah.
I had gray hairs in my head, I'm ashamed to say, when I figured out what the prodigal son was about.
Okay.
And when that hit me like a ton of bricks.
Good.
When I really understood what that was about.
Mm-hmm.
More on the other guy's side. Hey, I've been here all this time, I've been working hard, what is this?
Mm-hmm. But how many of us sometimes are like the other son?
Oh, sure, I think a lot of,
It's sibling rivalry?
life we are that way.
Yeah.
But that hit me like a ton of bricks, and I need to tell you, I was a little too old to figure it out.
Okay. I don't know if we're ever too old. Story on that, when I was novice director, there was a gentleman from another province who entered, and he was in his early 50s. He was a medical doctor. And he got tired of people coming up to him and saying, oh, you're a late vocation. He said, I'm not a late vocation, I'm the vocation when God called me. And I think that's true in so many things. Maybe we aren't ready to receive a gift. Okay, if God wants us to have that gift, God will continue, I think, to offer it to us. It's just a matter for us to continually be open and to surrender ourselves and to, to listen. To listen. That is what our society does not do well these days. We have too many things to get in the way of listening. Yes?
What's it like when you become aware of God's love and your own personal sin? What feeling do you get from that? Is it like pain, or is it happiness?
Okay. Can I throw that? What's it like when you had that experience of feeling your sinfulness, but also God's love with that? Is that part of the whole deal? What's that experience like? Yeah.
I received the gift of tears, and I received the gift of deep humility. Deep humility, humility knowing that I'm in the presence of love I will never totally understand.
Okay. So tears and that sense of humility. Part in the exercises, we are invited to pray for the gift of tears. We're invited to pray for the gift of tears. If you don't get them, that doesn't mean that you are not experiencing the grace. It's just that you do not have that special gift. But I like that sense of tears, but also that sense of humility, that you're really standing in the presence of God's love. And that can be very humbling, not in a bad way, not in a humiliating way, but in a way of appreciating, I know that relationship with my Creator. I have been created by this greatness, in love, and that could be pretty humbling. But it also, I would think, could also give us then the strength and the courage to move beyond that, with that same sense of love, I think. That makes sense? Does that answer your question? Any other responses to that? Yeah.
Different question. I don't understand it. I can't relate to question number 3. Especially the second part of it. What happened inside me when I mentioned the God is crazy and passionate about me. I can't attribute any emotions to God. So
Okay.
I can't really get anything out of it.
Okay, and again, some of these questions, they're going to touch some people differently and some not at all. I would say each of us has our own unique relationship with God. This does not connect with what your understanding or your image or your relationship with God is. That still does not mean you don't have that relationship. It's just that these are not the words you would use. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. Someone else might, that might be the words that helps them to understand it. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think one thing when you're talking about knowing God's love, I think on a lesser plateau, you can relate back to when you were a kid and learning about going to confession and the forgiveness of your sins. And how when you leave that confession as a youngster, you feel like a new person, and it's just like all that weight, not me, and you didn't even know, what, true sin was. You just, you go in and confess your sins. Well, the sense that when you left there, there was a big burden off your shoulders and you felt like that new person, was sort of something that you learned, at least in our stage of life, how it's being taught today, maybe totally different. I really couldn't tell you. Back, in the 50s and early 60s, the idea of going to confession, your sins, forgiven, by an almighty and an all-loving God was something that, when you went in, you felt one way, when you come out, you felt like, this great weight was lifted off your shoulders.
That can be an excellent, I think that hopefully is the experience people have when they go to the sacrament. I had sacrament earlier this week at a grade school, and my sense was that was the experience of the students. Listed in this one grade school.
That same type of feeling, like usually when you have the penance services at a retreat service,
yeah.
I think there's that same type of feeling, and I think at that time, as we're older, we begin to feel the sense of tearfulness, that not only is the burden released, but you feel the sorrow that you've hurt God, and that you've now been relieved and can feel His love.
Yes. I had that experience when I was in grade school, I think every time but once. And that was when I was much younger, and as I was leaving, the priest said, this was in the box, said, "Go and be a good little girl." I've learned from that experience as a priest. Watch what you say. Okay. One final comment or question?
Bill?
Yes.
I was touched by that one statement about what areas of the misery in the world moves your heart. And, I think that certainly encourages many of us to get involved in various volunteer activities for the poor.
Yes.
I think that's a very essential part of our life.
Well, and that can touch, over here. Sometimes by getting involved, that can help us feel good. Not that we do it just to feel good, but when we feel that connection with other people, I have been blessed in my life. So is there some way that I can return that, and that is connecting with the rest of the people of God, who might have a disaster. Maybe their town was wiped out from a tornado, or maybe these stories of kids who with bloated bellies, in different parts of the world, or down in our own city of Cincinnati, and maybe we aren't in a situation where we can take time off, or we might not even have the financial resources, but there are little things we maybe can do. Maybe we can support programs at our parish, or maybe we can just pray, the power of prayer. And I think sometimes we can dismiss that as nothing, when if that's all that we can do, then that is how we, really become associated with in a personalized way. Yeah, Tom.
When I looked at that statement and what areas of misery move my heart, the movement in my heart, well, on one hand, I think grammatically it encourages to think in terms of compassion about those things we want to get involved in to help the victims. But the movement in my heart, as I looked at some areas of misery, was anger.
Mm-hmm.
Anger, because so much of misery is caused by, not the hurricanes, but there's so much of the misery that we want to help the victims. There are the oppressors toward whom we may want to feel anger.
Yes.
I'm uncomfortable with that,
but that's honest, and I think that's human, and that's also a point to talk to God about. And what do we do with that anger, with that emotion? I mean, we talk about shadow sides. I think anger can be a shadow side to love and other things, but I think maybe that's a good first step. I don't know. Any other responses to?
Anger can simply be a call to action.
Yeah, good way of putting it. Do you hear that? Anger can be a call to action.
I want to hit somebody.
Please? What? What, Mary?
I was going to say it's a form of energy. It's just
That's right.
Any emotion has an energy attached to it, and you see them in that manner instead of kind of putting
That's right.
angry bad kind of thing.
That's right.
Right.
Good. See, and that could be one of those things. It might appear to be an awful thing, but maybe the blessing could be that it might be redirecting that energy, that passion, to something else. Okay. Yes.
Just a quick question. When you talked about 7 deadly sins,
Yeah.
and you said you could add more. You said deceit, I understand. You said fear.
Fear.
How do we get that?
The way I would look at that is I think we live oftentimes in fear, fear of risking, fear of committing ourselves, fear of the unknown, and that can be pretty paralyzing, or certainly it can keep us from an open mind or an open heart to where maybe I need to move in and be more active in a way that's appropriate as a Christian. Yeah. Pat?
It's the absence of trust.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And I get that with that a lot.
Okay. Yeah. Well, my final comment is, again, thank you for your attention tonight and coming. Hopefully, you'll continue to come to the other weeks if your schedule permits it. Again, there are many ways of coming to understand and appreciate the spiritual exercises. Certainly here at Milford, go to the websites. I'm also going to put a plug in for Xavier University's Mission and Identity Office. They have many resources available that you can find on the web page for Xavier University. What's the actual website that you would go to?
It's jesuitresourceoneword.org. jesuitresource.org.
Okay. And wonderful resources through Spiritual Center here in terms of day things, weekend things, long retreats, so take advantage of it. I guess just to prep you maybe for the continuation of the series. So started off with that sense of our creaturehood, being loved by God, being called really into that special relationship and experiencing that love, and then taking a look at our sinfulness. Where is it that we have been deficient in really accepting and living that love? Now that you've had this wonderful experience of owning your sinfulness and naming it, and it empowers you, that you've experienced God's great mercy through that, you just want to move on. Well, what is the only response? It's to love and to serve and to know Jesus. And that's the second week of the spiritual exercises. So the series is to be continued. Thank you for coming.
I want to thank you, Father Bill, for your passion, for your faith, and for your very faith-filled presentation. Please give him another round of applause, please. By way of a PSA, if you go to the Jesuit Spiritual Center website, we are videotaping these presentations, and they're on the website. So you can revisit what you experienced tonight with Father Bill, and in case you missed something or pick something up, it'll be there. Also, I want you to come back next week, because Father Fran Daly will be presenting on accepting and appreciating the call to discipleship through the exercises. So, again, your job, besides looking at your sinfulness, embracing it, and loving it, is to bring 200 of your closest friends next week to this gathering. Thank you, and God bless you. Be safe going on.